Emily sat in her quiet apartment, staring out the window into the city lights. The hum of the city outside was oddly calming. But today, there was something gnawing at her insides. It had been exactly 1 year since Michael, her older brother, had passed away in that car accident. The memory of the phone call she had received that night still haunted her. The sound of the police officer's voice, the weight of the words, "I'm sorry, Emily, he's gone." She had barely been able to process it. Michael had been her rock, the one person she could always count on. They had shared so much, grown up together, laughed, fought, and always supported each other. Losing him had left an emptiness in her heart that no amount of time seemed to heal. The clock on the wall ticked softly as Emily absent-mindedly scrolled through her phone, trying to distract herself from the overwhelming sense of loss. But then, her phone buzzed, and she looked down at the screen. The caller ID was blocked. She hesitated for a moment but decided to answer. Maybe it was a wrong number, maybe even a telemarketer. She was in no mood to talk to anyone, but out of habit, she pressed the green button. "Hello." Emily's voice sounded shaky, as if she was already anticipating bad news. At first, there was silence on the other end. Then the voice spoke, soft, hesitant, but unmistakable. It's Michael." Emily's heart stopped. The world around her seemed to tilt, as if the very air had been sucked out of the room. She blinked, struggling to comprehend what she had just heard. Couldn't be. It was impossible. "Michael? Is this a joke?" Emily's voice cracked, her breath coming in short gasps. Listen to me," Michael's voice said, urgent and familiar. "You have to get out of there. It's not safe. You're in danger." "Michael!" Emily nearly shouted, a mix of disbelief and desperation in her voice. "But you died. You died in the crash." "I know, Michael's voice replied, and it sounded so real, so vivid, that Emily could almost feel him standing beside her. "But I need you to listen to me. The truth is not what it seems. You have to find out what really happened. Someone's trying to keep you in the dark." Before she could say anything else, the call abruptly ended. The line went dead, and Emily was left staring at the screen, her hand trembling. The minutes ticked by as she sat frozen, unable to move or think. She hadn't imagined that voice. It was real. She knew it. But how could that be? Michael was dead. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, all jumbled together. Was it a prank? No, it couldn't be. There was something in his voice, a desperate urgency, that felt too real, too raw. She had to know more. Grabbing her coat, Emily rushed out of her apartment. She had to find answers, and somehow she knew deep down that this was only the beginning. Emily could barely focus as she stepped into the cold night air. Her hands trembled, her mind reeling from what had just happened. She had rushed out of her apartment without thinking, just needing to clear her head. The streetlights flickered above, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward her, pulling her deeper into her own confusion. The world felt eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes everything feel wrong. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she walked aimlessly, trying to make sense of the phone call. Her brother, Michael, had died a year ago. That was the truth. But the voice she had just heard, it couldn't have been a trick. The fear in his voice, the urgency, the way he had sounded so real. She had barely made it 2 blocks when her phone rang again, its shrill sound breaking the silence around her like a sharp crack of thunder. Emily's heart stopped, and she froze. She hesitated for a moment before pulling it out of her pocket. The screen read, "Blocked number." The same dread crept back into her stomach as she pressed the answer button. She braced herself, not knowing what to expect this time. "Hello?" Emily's voice shook, but she tried to keep it steady, afraid that if she showed any weakness, the fear would consume her. This time, there was no hesitation in the voice on the other end. It was deep, distorted, and not quite Michael's, but still eerily familiar. "Emily, you need to stop looking for answers," the voice said. It sounded like a warning, but there was an underlying layer of something sinister. "Some things are better left buried." "Who is this?" Emily demanded, her voice rising. "What do you want from me? Why are you calling me? Why are you pretending to be Michael?" There was a long pause, and Emily felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as the silence stretched on. Then, the voice spoke again, and this time it made her blood run cold. "Michael, he didn't die in the accident, Emily," the voice said, each word slow and deliberate. "He's still out there, but if you keep digging, you'll never find him. You'll find something much worse." Emily's stomach turned. The voice didn't make sense. Michael hadn't just disappeared from the crash. He was gone. She had seen the wreckage herself, had been at the funeral, had buried him. This was impossible. But the voice on the other end wasn't finished. "Michael's been trapped," it said, each word heavier than the last. "You can't help him, but you can help yourself. Stay away from the basement. Don't go down there." The call ended abruptly, leaving Emily standing in the middle of the street, the phone still pressed to her ear. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The words hung in the air like a suffocating fog. "Stay away from the basement." The words echoed in her head, repeating over and over. She had no idea what it meant, but something inside her, something primal, knew she had to find out. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a prank. There was something far deeper, far darker at play. Emily shook her head, trying to shake off the fear that was threatening to take over. She couldn't let it. She wouldn't let it. But how could she ignore what she had just heard? Without thinking, she found herself walking faster, heading toward her old house. The house she and Michael had grown up in. The house they had shared so many memories in. The house she hadn't stepped foot in since the night of the accident. Felt strange, returning there after so long. The place had always been a comfort, a safe haven where they could be together, away from the world. But now, as Emily stood in front of it, staring at the old wooden structure, it felt different. The house looked the same, tall, worn, but still standing. Yet something about it made her uneasy. The windows were dark, lifeless. The yard was overgrown, as if it hadn't been tended to in months. The memories of her brother, the sound of his laughter, the way he had always been there for her, flooded her mind. And then, the voice returned to her thoughts. "Stay away from the basement." She shivered, her breath coming out in quick bursts, and took a step forward. She wasn't going to let fear control her. She needed answers. As she approached the front door, Emily hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Should she really go in? What if this was a mistake? But then she remembered the phone call, Michael's voice, the warning. She couldn't back out now. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open, and the creak of the hinges sounded far too loud in the stillness. The familiar scent of dust and old wood filled her nose as she stepped inside. The house was eerily quiet, as if time itself had stopped when she left. Every room she walked into felt like a snapshot of the past, frozen in place. The living room was exactly how it had been the last time she saw it. The couch was still in the same spot. The bookshelf was filled with the same old books. The kitchen, too, looked unchanged. But Emily wasn't looking for memories. She was looking for answers. She walked through the house, each step feeling heavier than the last. As she reached the stairs leading down to the basement, her heart skipped a beat. The door at the bottom was closed, but there was something about it that made her blood run cold. It looked just like it always had, solid wood with the same rusty handle. But now, in the silence, it felt like it was waiting for her. She stood there for a moment, staring at the door. The voice on the phone echoed in her mind. Don't go down there. But she couldn't help herself. She had to know what was behind that door. Taking a step forward, Emily reached for the handle. She turned it slowly, and the door creaked open. The air that rushed out felt damp and cold, like the air from a tomb. A sudden wave of unease washed over her, but she pushed it aside. She stepped down the stairs, her feet echoing in the darkness. The basement was just as she remembered it, dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. Old furniture was stacked against the walls, covered in sheets of dust. Boxes of forgotten things were scattered on the floor, but something felt off. The air was thick, heavier than it should have been. Then, in the corner of the room, she saw something that made her freeze. There, in the shadows, was a figure. A shadowy figure that seemed to move, twitching in the dim light. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she stepped back, her heart pounding. What was that? Before she could react, the figure disappeared, fading into the shadows like it had never been there at all. Emily stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, her breath shallow and quick. Her eyes were locked on the spot where the shadowy figure had been. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat echoing loudly in the stillness of the basement. The dim light from the single bulb overhead flickered, casting unsettling shapes on the walls. She tried to convince herself that it was nothing, a trick of the light or her overactive imagination. But deep down, she knew better. Something wasn't right. Taking a step forward, Emily scanned the room, her eyes darting to every corner. The air was heavy, thick with a damp, musty smell that made it hard to breathe. Old memories of playing hide and seek with Michael in this very basement came rushing back. But those memories felt distant now, overshadowed by the creeping sense of dread that had settled in her chest. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, making her jump. She pulled it out with trembling hands and glanced at the screen. It was another blocked number. She hesitated before answering, her thumb hovering over the screen. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to run back upstairs and leave this house behind forever. But another part, the part desperate for answers, couldn't resist. She swiped to answer. Hello. Her voice was barely above a whisper. For a moment, there was only static on the other end. Then, a familiar voice spoke, low and urgent. Emily, it was Michael, or at least it sounded like him. Michael, she asked, her voice trembling. Is it really you? Where are you? The voice hesitated. I don't have much time. You need to leave. You shouldn't have come back here. Emily gripped the phone tightly, her knuckles turning white. What's happening, Michael? What's going on? You're supposed to be... She couldn't bring herself to say the word. Dead, Michael finished for her. I know, but there's more to it than you think. I can't explain right now. They're watching. They? Who's watching? Emily demanded, her fear mixing with frustration. Michael didn't answer. Instead, the static grew louder, drowning out his voice. Then, just before the call ended, she heard one last chilling sentence. They won't let you leave. The line went dead. Emily stared at the phone, her mind racing. None of this made sense. Michael was gone. He had been gone for a year. Yet here he was calling her, warning her. And now, the cryptic message. They won't let you leave. A sudden creak from above made her spin around. The sound of footsteps echoed through the house, slow and deliberate. Emily's stomach dropped. She wasn't alone. She climbed the stairs as quietly as she could, her heart pounding in her ears. When she reached the top, she paused, peeking through the crack in the door. The hallway was empty, but the sound of footsteps continued, growing fainter as if whoever or whatever was walking was moving further away. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Emily stepped into the hallway. The air was colder here, and the shadows seemed darker, almost alive. She followed the sound of the footsteps, her own movements slow and cautious. They led her to the living room. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, Emily could see the faint glow of the television. But she hadn't turned it on. She was sure of that. Pushing the door open, she stepped inside. The old television set in the corner flickered, displaying static. The room was empty, but the air was charged with an eerie energy. Emily approached the TV, her reflection distorted in the cracked glass of the screen. As she reached for the power button, the static cleared, and an image appeared. It was a video, shaky and grainy, as if it had been recorded on an old camera. The footage showed the basement. Her basement. Emily's breath hitched as she watched the screen. The camera panned slowly across the room, showing the same boxes, the same furniture. Then it stopped. The lens focused on the corner where she had seen the shadowy figure. And there it was again. The figure was clearer this time. It was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, glowed faintly, like dying embers. Emily stepped back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. The figure in the video turned its head sharply, as if it could see her through the screen. Then the video ended and the screen went black. A loud bang from upstairs jolted Emily back to reality. She turned toward the staircase, her instincts screaming at her to leave. But something else, something deeper, told her she couldn't go, not yet. She climbed the stairs, each step creaking beneath her weight. The hallway upstairs was darker than she remembered, the shadows deeper, stretching out like fingers ready to grab her. The noise had come from Michael's old room. The door was slightly open, just enough for her to see the edge of the bed. Taking a deep breath, she pushed it open the rest of the way. The room was just as it had been when Michael was alive. His posters still lined the walls, his guitar propped up in the corner. But now it felt wrong. The air was thick and oppressive, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. On the desk by the window, something caught her eye. A notebook. She approached it slowly, her hands trembling as she picked it up. Flipping through the pages, she realized it was Michael's journal. The entries were normal at first, notes about school, friends, music. But then they took a darker turn. March 15th. There's something wrong with the house. I've been hearing things at night. Footsteps, whispers. But when I check, no one's there. April 2nd. I saw it again. The shadow in the basement is getting closer. I don't know what it wants, but I can feel it watching me. April 20th. I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see it. It's inside my dreams now. I don't think I can escape it. The last entry was dated the night of the accident, May 3rd. If anyone finds this, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It's my fault. The shadow, it's taken me. Don't trust it. Don't let it in. Emily closed the notebook, her hands shaking. The shadow, it had haunted Michael, driven him to the edge. And now it was coming for her. A chill ran down her spine as the door behind her slammed shut, trapping her inside. The room was pitch black now. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps as she stumbled toward the door, her hands searching for the handle. She twisted it, but it wouldn't budge. She was trapped. "Let me out!" she screamed, her voice breaking the heavy silence. The shadows in the room seemed to ripple in response, like dark waves on a quiet sea. From somewhere behind her, a faint whisper emerged. It was low and guttural, barely audible. Emily froze, her heart racing. She turned slowly, her eyes straining to see in the darkness. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The whisper grew louder, clearer. It wasn't a single voice, but many, overlapping and swirling around her. They spoke in fragments, their words disjointed and eerie. "He's watching. Don't let it in. Run while you can." Emily backed up until her shoulders hit the wall. She felt the rough wallpaper against her skin, grounding her for a moment. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the voices. Then, in the corner near the bed, she saw it. The shadow was there, taller and darker than before. Its elongated form seemed to absorb the light around it, leaving the space unnaturally dim. It didn't move, but Emily felt its gaze. Cold, invasive, and utterly inhuman. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, and the words took on a sinister edge. "She knows too much. It's too late. He's here." The shadow began to move, its form gliding across the room without a sound. Emily pressed herself harder against the wall, her hands clutching at the notebook she had taken from the desk. "What do you want?" she cried, her voice breaking. The shadow stopped, mere feet away from her. The air grew colder, and the whispers fell silent. For a moment, there was only the sound of her rapid breathing. Then, the figure extended a long, shadowy arm, pointing toward the notebook in her hands. Emily glanced down at it, the words from Michael's journal flashing in her mind. "Don't let it in." Suddenly, the shadow lunged. Emily screamed and ducked, throwing herself to the side as the shadow passed through the space where she had been standing. The air felt like ice, biting at her skin as she scrambled toward the window. She yanked at the curtains, letting in the faint glow of the streetlight outside. The light seemed to weaken the shadow, its form flickering like a dying flame. Without thinking, Emily grabbed the notebook and flung it at the figure. The shadow recoiled, its form writhing as if in pain. The whispers returned, but this time they were louder, angrier. The room seemed to shake as the voices rose to a crescendo. Emily seized her chance. She bolted for the door, her hands fumbling with the lock. This time, it gave way, and she stumbled out into the hallway. She didn't stop to think. She ran down the stairs, her footsteps echoing through the empty house. Her only thought was to get out, to escape the suffocating darkness that seemed to follow her. But as she reached the front door, she froze. It was open. A cold wind blew in, carrying with it the faint sound of Michael's voice. "Emily!" She turned, her eyes wide with fear. Standing in the doorway was a figure, a man. His face was shrouded in darkness, but she recognized the silhouette. It was Michael. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You're not real. This isn't real." The figure stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. As he entered the dim light of the hallway, Emily could see his face clearly. It was Michael, but his eyes were hollow, his expression devoid of life. "Emily," he said again, his voice flat and emotionless. "You shouldn't have come back." Tears streamed down her face as she backed away. "You're not my brother." "What are you?" Michael, or whatever this thing was, smiled. It was a cold, chilling smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You'll understand soon enough," he said. "The house, it doesn't let go. Keeps us. All of us." Emily's back hit the wall, and she realized she had nowhere to go. The figure stepped closer, his shadow stretching out toward her like dark tendrils. Then suddenly the whispers stopped. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Michael's figure froze, his head tilting as if listening to something only he could hear. Without warning, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the house. Emily was left alone, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what had just happened, but she wasn't about to stick around to find out. She ran out of the house, her bare feet hitting the cold pavement as she fled into the night. Hours later, Emily sat in her car, parked on the side of the road a few miles from the house. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. She had tried to call the police, but when they arrived, the house had been empty. No shadows, no whispers, no Michael. They had looked at her with a mix of pity and skepticism, their questions implying she had imagined it all. But Emily knew what she had seen. She opened the notebook, her eyes scanning the final entries again. One phrase stood out, underlined multiple times in shaky handwriting. "The house keeps us." Emily slammed the notebook shut, her hands trembling. She couldn't go back. Not to that house, not to the shadow, not to the whispers. But deep down, she knew it wasn't over. The house wouldn't let her go so easily. Emily couldn't sleep. She sat in the driver's seat of her car, staring at the darkness outside. The faint glow of the streetlights cast eerie shadows on the pavement, and every small sound made her jump. The notebook lay open on the passenger seat, taunting her with its cryptic warnings. "The house keeps us." The phrase repeated in her mind like a haunting melody. She had escaped, but something told her she wasn't free. The image of Michael's hollow eyes and the shadow in the basement lingered, refusing to fade. She tried calling her friend Sarah, but the line was dead. She attempted to send a message, but her phone refused to connect. It was as if the world had gone silent, leaving her utterly alone. Maybe I imagined it all, she thought, but deep down she knew the truth. As dawn began to break, Emily felt a sudden urge to go back. She didn't want to, but something inside her whispered that she had no choice. The house wasn't just a place. It was a trap, and she had stepped right into it. Back at the house, Emily parked a few blocks away, her heart pounding as she walked toward the house. It looked ordinary in the daylight, the kind of place families might live in, with laughter and warmth filling the rooms. But Emily knew better. She stepped onto the porch, her hands shaking as she reached for the door. Creaked open as if inviting her in. The air inside was cold, much colder than it should have been. She shivered as she stepped into the hallway, her eyes scanning for any sign of movement. "Michael," she called, her voice echoing. There was no response. The house was eerily quiet, but it didn't feel empty. Emily could sense something watching her, something lurking just out of sight. She moved cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The living room was as she had left it, the furniture covered in a thin layer of dust. The basement door stood ajar, and she felt a chill run down her spine. I should leave, she thought, but her feet carried her forward, as if drawn by an invisible force. The basement, the stairs creaked under her weight as she descended into the darkness. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint smell of damp earth filled her nostrils. At the bottom, she flicked on the light switch, but nothing happened. The bulb overhead was shattered, leaving the basement bathed in shadows. Emily took out her flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom. She swept the light across the room, her heart racing as the shadows seemed to shift and dance. The journal entries had mentioned the basement. Michael had written about the whispers, the shadow, and the strange markings on the walls. Emily aimed her flashlight at the far corner, where a faint glimmer caught her eye. She moved closer, her breath coming in shallow gasps. There, etched into the concrete wall, were strange symbols. They were crude and jagged, as if carved by desperate hands. Emily reached out to touch them, but as her fingers brushed the surface, a low whisper filled the room. "Emily," she spun around, the flashlight shaking in her hands. The shadow was there, looming larger than ever. It seemed to pulsate, its form shifting and twisting like smoke. "Why won't you leave me alone?" she cried, her voice breaking. The shadow didn't answer, but the whispers grew louder. They swirled around her, filling her head with a cacophony of voices. "It's your turn now. The house chooses. You can't escape." Emily backed away, her flashlight flickering. She tripped over something on the floor and fell, the beam of light swinging wildly. When she looked up, the shadow was inches away, its form towering over her. She screamed, scrambling backward until her back hit the wall. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. The shadow didn't move, but Emily felt its presence pressing down on her, suffocating and relentless. She closed her eyes, bracing for whatever was coming. Then, she heard a voice. "Emily, get up." Her eyes snapped open. Standing in the doorway at the top of the stairs was Michael. He looked pale and weary, but his eyes were no longer hollow. They were filled with urgency. "Michael," she whispered. "Move," he shouted. The command jolted her into action. She scrambled to her feet and ran toward him, the shadow lunging after her. She could feel its icy tendrils reaching for her, but she didn't stop. Michael grabbed her arm and pulled her out of the basement, slamming the door shut behind them. A brother's warning. They stood in the hallway, both of them breathing heavily. Emily clung to Michael, tears streaming down her face. "I thought you were dead," she said, her voice trembling. "I was," he replied, his tone grim. "At least part of me was. The house, it doesn't let go. It keeps us here, trapped between life and death." Emily stared at him, her mind racing. "What do you mean? What's happening here?" Michael hesitated, his eyes filled with pain. "It's the house. It feeds on us. Our fears, our pain, our memories. The shadow, it's part of the house. And now it's chosen you." "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I don't belong here. I didn't ask for this." "Neither did I," he said softly. "But once you're in, there's no way out. Unless what?" she demanded, gripping his arm. Michael looked away, his expression haunted. "There's a way to stop it, but it's dangerous. You have to face it, go back into the basement and confront the shadow. If you don't, it will keep coming for you. It won't stop until it has you." Emily's stomach churned. The thought of going back into that dark, suffocating space made her want to scream. But Michael's words left her no choice. "How do I stop it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tattered piece of paper. On it were the same strange symbols she had seen on the wall. "These are the markings that seal its power," he said. "You have to carve them into the floor of the basement. It's the only way to weaken it." Emily took the paper, her hands trembling. "What happens if I fail?" Michael didn't answer. His silence was more chilling than any words could have been. Emily sat on the floor of the living room, staring at the symbols. She could hear the faint whispers again, coming from the basement. They were calling to her, urging her to return. She didn't want to go back, but she knew she couldn't run. The house would find her no matter where she went. Taking a deep breath, she stood up and headed toward the basement door. Her flashlight was in one hand, the paper in the other. Michael watched her go, his expression somber. "Be careful," he said. She nodded, her heart pounding as she opened the door and stepped into the darkness once more. The basement door creaked open, revealing the steep staircase leading into darkness. Emily hesitated at the top, her breath shaky. The paper with the strange symbols crumpled in her hand as she gripped it tightly, trying to summon courage. The air felt heavy, pressing against her chest, and the whispers were louder now. They echoed up from below, faint but menacing, like voices carried on a cold wind. "Emily, "Come back." The words sent a chill down her spine, but she forced herself to take the first step. The flashlight in her other hand flickered, casting nervous beams across the narrow walls. She descended slowly, each creak of the wooden stairs amplified in the oppressive silence. With every step, the cold deepened, seeping into her bones. When she reached the bottom, the darkness seemed alive. Shadows twisted and writhed as if aware of her presence. The symbols on the wall glowed faintly, an eerie, pulsating light that made her feel both drawn and repelled. Emily knelt on the cold concrete floor, setting the flashlight down so its beam illuminated the paper in her hand. Her fingers trembled as she traced the lines of the symbols, committing them to memory. Michael's voice echoed in her mind. "Carve them into the floor. It's the only way to weaken it." She pulled out the small knife Michael had given her, its blade dull but sturdy. Pressing it against the floor, she began to etch the first symbol. The whispers grew louder. "Stop! Leave! You don't belong here!" Emily clenched her jaw, her hands trembling as she carved. The blade scraped against the concrete, the sound grating but steady. Suddenly, the air shifted. The oppressive silence was replaced by a low, guttural growl. Emily froze, her heart pounding as the shadows around her began to move. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw it, the shadow. It was no longer confined to a corner. It moved freely now, a mass of darkness with no discernible form, yet unmistakably menacing. The growl deepened, vibrating through the floor and into her chest. Emily clutched the knife, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. "I won't stop," she whispered, more to herself than to the shadow. "I'm not afraid of you." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but she forced herself to continue carving. The shadow lunged. Emily screamed as the darkness engulfed her, cold and suffocating. It felt like icy fingers clawing at her skin, pulling her into an endless void. She swung the knife wildly, the blade passing through nothing but air. "Leave me alone," she shouted, her voice cracking. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, a cacophony of voices that drowned out her thoughts. But then she remembered Michael's words. "It feeds on your fear." Emily closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe. She focused on the feel of the knife in her hand, the roughness of the concrete beneath her fingers. Slowly, the noise began to fade. The shadow hesitated, its form flickering like a dying flame. Emily opened her eyes, her heart still racing. The shadow loomed, but it no longer felt invincible. She realized that its power came from her fear, her doubt. "You don't scare me," she said, her voice steadier now. The shadow recoiled slightly, its edges fraying. Emily turned back to the floor, carving the next symbol with renewed determination. The whispers persisted, but they no longer held the same weight. One by one, the symbols began to take shape. Each line, each curve felt like a small victory. As she worked on the last symbol, the shadow grew desperate. It lashed out, the darkness swirling around her like a storm. Objects from the basement flew through the air, slamming against the walls. The flashlight toppled over, plunging the room into near darkness. Emily fumbled to pick it up, her fingers brushing against the cold floor. "Almost there," she whispered, gritting her teeth. She carved the final line, pressing the knife harder against the concrete. The moment the last symbol was complete, the room shook violently. A piercing scream echoed through the basement, a sound so inhuman it made Emily's skin crawl. The shadow convulsed, its form collapsing in on itself. The symbols on the floor glowed brighter, their light driving back the darkness. For the first time, Emily felt warmth in the air. The oppressive cold was lifting. As the light from the symbols spread, Michael appeared at the top of the stairs. He looked relieved but wary. "You did it," he said, his voice soft. Emily climbed the stairs, her legs shaking. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Michael hesitated, his expression darkening. "Not yet. The house won't let go that easily." Emily's stomach sank. "What do you mean?" "The shadow is weakened, but the house is still alive," Michael explained. "It's part of something bigger, something older. If you want to be free, you have to destroy it completely." "How?" Michael didn't answer immediately. He looked at her with a mix of sadness and determination. "There's a way, but it's dangerous. You'll have to go to the heart of the house, the place where it all began." Emily's hands clenched into fists. She was exhausted, terrified, and desperate to escape. But she knew Michael was right. "Show me," she said. Michael nodded, leading her toward the hallway. The house seemed quieter now, but Emily could feel it watching her, waiting. As they walked, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The hallway stretched before Emily and Michael, its walls seeming to close in with every step. The air was thick, each breath feeling like an effort. The dim light from the flickering bulbs cast eerie shadows that danced along the cracked walls. Michael walked ahead, his shoulders tense, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. Emily followed closely, gripping the knife she had used to carve the symbols. The blade felt warm now, as if it had absorbed some of the energy from the ritual. "Where are we going?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "To the oldest part of the house," Michael replied. "It's where everything began. The house's power is strongest there, but it's also its weakest point." Emily frowned. "That doesn't make any sense." Michael paused, turning to face her. "The heart of the house is like a wound. It's where the darkness first took root. If we can sever its connection there, we can end this." Before Emily could respond, the floor beneath them groaned, a deep, unsettling sound that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. As they moved deeper into the house, the familiar layout began to shift. Hallways twisted and turned in impossible directions, and doors appeared where there hadn't been any before. "It's trying to confuse us," Michael said, his voice steady but strained. "Don't lose focus. Stay close." Emily nodded, her grip tightening on the knife. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows on the walls seemed to follow them, shifting unnaturally when she wasn't looking directly at them. They came to a door at the end of the hallway. Unlike the others, this one was different, old and heavy, with iron hinges and deep scratches across its surface. "This is it," Michael said, placing a hand on the doorknob. Emily felt her chest tighten. "What's on the other side?" "Everything the house has been hiding," Michael replied. "Be ready." The door creaked open, revealing a staircase spiraling downward. The steps were uneven, carved from stone, and the walls were damp with an unpleasant smell of mildew and decay. Emily's stomach churned as they descended. The air grew colder with every step, and a faint humming sound filled her ears, growing louder the deeper they went. At the bottom of the stairs, they entered a cavernous room. The walls were lined with what looked like ancient carvings, symbols similar to the ones Emily had etched upstairs. In the center of the room was a large stone pedestal, and atop it lay a black, pulsating mass. "That's it," Michael said, his voice grim. "The heart of the house." The mass seemed alive, writhing and twisting as if aware of their presence. The humming sound grew louder, resonating in Emily's chest. Michael handed Emily a small vial filled with a shimmering liquid. "This is what will destroy it," he explained, "but you have to pour it directly onto the heart. It won't be easy. The house will fight back." Emily took the vial, her hands trembling. "What do you mean, fight back?" As if in response, the room began to shake. The carvings on the walls glowed a fiery red, and the shadows in the corners of the room came alive, stretching and merging into monstrous forms. "Exactly that," Michael said, pulling a piece of chalk from his pocket. "I'll hold them off. You focus on getting to the heart." Before Emily could protest, Michael began drawing symbols on the floor, chanting under his breath. A barrier of light surrounded him, keeping the shadows at bay. "Go!" he shouted, his voice breaking through the chaos. Emily ran toward the pedestal, the vial clutched tightly in her hand. The shadows surged toward her, their forms shifting between solid and smoke-like. One of them lunged, and she swung her knife instinctively, the blade slicing through it. To her surprise, the shadow recoiled, its form dissolving into nothing. The knife was more powerful than she had realized. She pressed forward, slashing at the shadows that tried to block her path. Each step felt like a battle, the air growing heavier and the whispers louder. "You can't win. Turn back. Join us." Emily ignored the voices, her focus locked on the pulsating mass ahead. She climbed onto the pedestal, her heart racing as she unscrewed the vial. As she poured the shimmering liquid onto the black mass, a deafening screech filled the room. The liquid hissed and bubbled as it made contact, and the mass convulsed violently. The shadows around her shrieked, their forms unraveling like smoke caught in a strong wind. The carvings on the walls cracked and crumbled, the fiery glow extinguished. Michael's voice cut through the noise. "It's working. Keep going." Emily poured the last drop of the liquid, and the mass exploded in a burst of blinding light. She was thrown backward, landing hard on the stone floor. When she opened her eyes, the room was silent. The mass was gone, and the oppressive weight in the air had lifted. Michael helped her to her feet, his expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. "You did it," he said. Emily looked around the room, now dim and lifeless. "Is it over?" Michael hesitated. "For now. The house is weakened, but its roots run deep. It might take time, but we've severed its connection to this place." Emily nodded, though she felt far from relieved. The memories of the shadows and whispers lingered, a haunting reminder of what they had faced. As they climbed back up the stairs, the house seemed quieter, almost peaceful. But Emily knew better than to trust appearances. "What happens next?" she asked as they stepped into the hallway. Michael glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "We leave, and we make sure no one ever comes back." The house was eerily silent as Emily and Michael stood in the main hallway. The oppressive darkness that once clung to every corner had lifted, replaced by an unsettling stillness. The air felt lighter, yet it carried a strange weight of unfinished business. "Is it really over?" Emily asked, gripping the knife tightly, still wary of her surroundings. Michael glanced around, his expression thoughtful. "The heart is gone, and the house has lost its power, but remnants of its influence might still linger. We need to leave before it finds a way to recover." Emily nodded, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. After everything, walking away didn't feel right. There was a tug deep inside her, a sense that the house wasn't quite done with them. As they turned toward the front door, a faint sound stopped them in their tracks. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails against glass. Michael froze. "Don't listen to it," he said sharply, grabbing Emily's arm. "It's trying to lure us back in." But Emily couldn't help herself. She turned her head toward the source of the sound. At the far end of the hallway, the cracked mirror she had seen on her first day in the house shimmered faintly, as if something or someone was moving behind it. "Emily, no," Michael warned, but it was too late. She stepped closer to the mirror, her reflection becoming clearer with each step. But something was wrong. The reflection wasn't hers. It looked like her, but the expression was wrong. the eyes too hollow, the smile too wide. "Help us," the reflection whispered, its voice distorted and echoing. "We're still trapped." Emily stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. "Michael, they're still here," she said, her voice trembling. Michael grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "It's not real. The house is trying to pull you back. We need to leave now." "But what if it's true?" Emily insisted, tears welling in her eyes. "What if there are others trapped here like my dad? We can't just leave them." Michael's expression softened, but he shook his head firmly. "You've done enough. You can't save everyone." Emily hesitated, her heart torn. But as the mirror shimmered again, she made up her mind. Pulling free from Michael's grip, she ran toward it. "Emily!" Michael shouted, but she didn't stop. The mirror's surface rippled like water as she reached out to touch it. Her fingers sank into the glass, and with a sudden pull, she was yanked through. Emily landed hard on a cold, black floor. The air was thick, filled with an unnatural chill that made her skin crawl. Around her was a void, endless and empty, except for faint whispers that seemed to come from all directions. "She's here. Save us. It's too late." She stood, clutching the knife tightly. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice echoing in the emptiness. Shapes began to emerge from the darkness. Figures, faint and translucent, their faces twisted in fear and despair. "We are the ones it couldn't consume," one of them said, their voice barely audible. "But we are trapped. The house won't let us go." Emily's heart ached. "How can I free you?" The figures pointed behind her. She turned to see a glowing orb suspended in the void, pulsing faintly. "The last fragment of its heart," the figures whispered. "Destroy it and we can be free." As Emily approached the orb, the air grew heavier, and the whispers turned into screams. The shadows in the void coalesced, forming a massive, monstrous figure that loomed over her. "You dare defy me?" the figure roared, its voice shaking the void. Emily's hands trembled, but she raised the knife. "You've taken enough from me," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. The figure lunged at her, its form shifting and writhing. Emily dodged, the knife slicing through the shadows. The figure recoiled, but it wasn't enough. She ran toward the orb, the knife glowing faintly as she neared it. The figure roared, its form stretching to block her path, but she didn't stop. With all her strength, she plunged the knife into the orb. A blinding light erupted from the orb, and the void began to crumble. The figures around her cried out, their forms dissolving into the light. "Thank you," they whispered, their voices fading. The monstrous figure screamed in rage, its form disintegrating as the light consumed it. Emily felt herself being pulled upward, the void collapsing around her. She gasped as she was thrown back into the hallway, the mirror shattering behind her. Michael was there, his face a mix of relief and anger. "Are you insane?" he shouted. "You could have been trapped forever." Emily sat up, breathing heavily. "I couldn't leave them," she said simply. Michael helped her to her feet, shaking his head. "You're braver than I'll ever be." The house groaned around them, the walls cracking and the floors buckling. "It's falling apart," Michael said. "We need to go. Now." They ran toward the front door, the house collapsing behind them. Outside, the night was eerily calm. The house stood in ruins, its power finally gone. Emily turned to Michael. "It's really over this time, isn't it?" He nodded. "You made sure of that." As they walked away, Emily glanced back one last time. The house seemed smaller now, no longer the menacing presence it once was. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that some part of it would always stay with her.